Hey Internet, my name's Jeff and I'm a pastor, and most recently on Wednesday nights in the Bible study that I teach, we have been talking about each of the passages in the Bible that talk about homosexuality, and last night we addressed the book of Romans, chapter 1, verses 26 through 27. So if you have a Bible, then you can open it up and take a look at those verses, or you could go onto a website like BibleGateway.com and look those verses up. Couple of things before we get started. One is that I should turn off the notifications on my phone because I got interrupted by a phone call last time, so I'm going to do that right now. Did that work? Okay, I think that worked. Oh, yeah. The first real thing, other than adjusting my phone, is that I'm relying heavily this week on research that was done by Matthew Vines for his fantastic book, God and the Gay Christian. You should definitely check this book out if you're interested in this topic a little bit more. And then the second thing before we get to this passage is that, as it was a couple weeks ago, we will be talking a little bit about sexual violence. So if you are sensitive to that kind of thing, then this might be a good video to skip. All right, so let's get to the passage. Again, this is the book of Romans, chapter 1, verses 26 through 27, and it says, "For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way, also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with their passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their persons the due penalty of their error." Now, I want to talk about the immediate context of these two verses. The immediate context is that Paul is talking about the idolatry that was going on in the city of Rome that he was writing to. And specifically, he was talking about how idolatry was a disruption of the created order. So basically, for Paul, the created order would be that God is kind of at the top of the hierarchy, God's in charge of everything, and then there are human beings, and then there's creation, which is tended to by human beings. But if you zoom in on this created order a little bit more, then you're going to find some more nuances. Like, for example, angels are somewhere in between God and human beings. Or you'll find that even amongst the animals, there are some animals that are clean or unclean, so there are some that are, I guess, better than others. But when you get to human beings, what you find is that men, on this hierarchy, created order, whatever you want to call it, men are greater than women. That was something that Paul would consider natural from the worldview that he was writing in and the worldview that he was coming from. So when Paul writes these two verses that reference men having sex with other men and women having sex with other women, he's actually using this as an example. It's not like Paul is sitting down to write his exhaustive views about homosexuality and all what it was and that kind of thing. Instead, he's using it as an example of something, and it's an example of how the Romans are disrupting this created order that he believed in at that time. Next thing that I want to talk about, next thing that we need to talk about if we're really going to understand this passage, is we need to talk about why men had sex with other men in the ancient world, in ancient Rome. The first reason that men had sex with other men in the ancient world was rape. We've talked about this before. Basically, it was an expression of domination or humiliation for another person. The second reason was sexual excess, I guess is something that you might say. So men, who again in the first century regarded women as the weaker sex, basically would say to themselves, you know what? Women are simple. I need a real challenge. I'm going to try instead to have sex with another man. So it was almost like men having sex with another man. It was like a challenge in the ancient world. It was something new to conquer, some new conquest to take part in. Another reason was prostitution. And under that heading of prostitution, particularly the prostitution of young boys. So if a man wanted to keep his masculinity, which was something that was really important in the ancient world, as we just talked about with that hierarchy, if a man wanted to keep his masculinity intact, but still have a different kind of sex than they were used to and a different kind of conquest than they were used to, then they would have sex with boys because boys were considered to be more effeminate. But by and large, here's why men didn't have sex with other men in the ancient world, or women didn't have sex with other women in the ancient world. It wasn't because they were in a committed monogamous relationship with one another and they wanted to express that love for one another physically. By and large, this just wasn't something that was done in the ancient world. It was done for all of these other reasons, these other kind of sinister reasons. Not kind of sinister, these other sinister reasons. So what exactly was this sex that Paul was talking about? What was this sex act that Paul was talking about in verses... Which verses are we talking about again? Oh, yeah. What is this sex act that Paul is referring to in verses 26 and 27 of Romans chapter 1? Well, he calls it unnatural. He says that the men were consumed with passion and that it was a shameless act. Now we need to remember, this is a patriarchal society, which means that men on that hierarchy, that order of creation, men are higher than women. So what's unnatural about this, for Paul anyway, who's writing with this worldview in his mind, what was unnatural about it might be that men were taking a more passive role in sex and women were taking a more active role in sex. And when we find these words like shameless and unnatural with regards to sex in other contemporary literature, that's actually what we find. What's shameless and unnatural about it, at least for the ancients, were the fact that men were being dominated by women, or men were taking a more passive role in sex and women were taking a more active role. So one philosopher, Philo, one ancient philosopher, said that gay sex between two males spreads the female disease. Yeah, how about that? So for Philo, it wasn't a matter of, oh, two men are having sex with each other, that's terrible. The reason for him that it was terrible was because it spread the disease of femininity. I should probably give a disclaimer here. Those, again, aren't my words. These are Philo's words. And then Plutarch, quoting Plato, said this. He said of men having sex with other men, they allow themselves to be covered and mounted like cattle. Now, again, for him, it's not necessarily the sex act, but it's the fact that there's something unnatural about it in that it defies that created order of where animals are, where men are, where women are. And we should probably say about this created order, we don't believe that anymore. I mean, a lot of us don't believe that anymore. At least we profess not to believe that anymore. We don't actively believe that men are better than women. We just pay men more for the same work, but that's beside the point. We don't follow that created order anymore. We believe that men and women are created equally. But for the ancients, this was the big problem, and that's the mindset that Paul was writing in. So it's not necessarily two gay people who are having sex, expressing their love for each other physically within the context of a monogamous relationship. Instead, they think it's wrong because it messes with that created order. Also, we should probably point out about this passage that it's not necessarily the sex that Paul is condemning. But it's the overt lust. It's the fact that they're, to use Paul's words, consumed with passion for one another. So you find an early commentator of the book of Romans named John Chrysostom. He writes this, "For he," referring to Paul, "for he does not say that they were enamored of one another, but that they were consumed by lust for one another. You see that the whole of desire comes from an excess which cannot contain itself." So for so many different reasons here, and look, as I've been saying throughout these videos, you can totally disagree with me here, and that's fine, but I think that what this passage is actually getting at is a condemnation of being consumed with passion for another person. It's not necessarily about the sex act, but it's about the fact that there's this rabid lust that's being lived into. I think that that's more what Paul is probably condemning here. And if he is condemning same-sex practice, which I think in a way he is, he's coming at it from the context of somebody who, I mean, his only examples of same-sex practice were rape, domination, humiliation, sexual excess, pederasty, and prostitution. So those are probably the things that Paul is condemning. We're not comparing apples to apples here when we're talking about the ancient expression of homosexuality and the modern expression of homosexuality. We're talking about two very different things here, and Paul likely wouldn't have had any sort of understanding of two people in the same gender having a committed relationship to one another. And once again, I think that Paul is condemning, or part of what Paul is condemning, is the disruption of this created order, which we just don't really believe in anymore, because we don't believe that men are inherently better than women. And we view masculinity and femininity a little bit differently now. Also, as we were talking about this last night, one thing that stood out to people was that Paul says that their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, in the same way the men giving up natural intercourse with women. So that basically means that they're shifting here. So this isn't necessarily gay people having sex with each other. This might be heterosexual people having gay sex within the context of rampant lust. Because again, there's an exchange that's happening there. There's a shift that's happening there. So we have to continue to ask, what really is Paul condemning here? Why is he condemning it? Is it the same thing as modern expressions of homosexuality? And personally, again, you can totally disagree with me here, I don't think it is. I think that we're dealing with two different things, two very different mindsets. Anyway, that's it for this week. Thanks for tuning in. Click like and subscribe, as always, because those are good things to do, because then more people can find me. If you have any questions, then you can feel free to leave them in the comments. I might see them if you leave them there. Again, I'm kind of new to YouTube, but you can also email me or find me on social media. Thanks, everybody. Grace and peace.